Okay, this is where we had left off in part 11a of GGS, and I was explaining that Paul is going to go into a series of what if the rapture happens scenarios, beginning here, in order to tally to a 21, which is the number for temple building, that is a very provocative and strong meter in Psalm 90 especially. But before I do that, I think I ought to kind of read you into the picture so you know what these numbers are in advance. So see, I've got my mouse now on the big 4 at the left in about the middle of the screen, which is verse 4. And if you click on that 4, you go to the note for that verse. And then you see below it, you can just go back to verse 4 like this. Okay, that's not so easy to tell in the document, so I'm showing it to you now. So you click on the big 4 to go to its note, and that's true for each of the other boxed verse numbers too. And then you're at verse 4's note, and in verse 4 I go through this Anno Domini accounting in more detail than I did in the video. Okay, and I explain the 56 in more detail here, and then here are the meter maps that you can use to compare the use of 56. But one of the other things I go through is what the expected rapture dates were. Okay, and that right now is on page 20. Probably will stay page 20, depends on what editing I have to do. And we're going to just walk through what those were, because this is not known to Christendom either. Christendom doesn't know that under the Jewish law, there was an expected date for Messiah to come, an actual date. Now you can find this information on the internet, but you find it in Jewish dispensationalism. And because we have been so inculcated with Calvinism, and I'm sorry to say Catholicism too, both of which explain away the rapture, this isn't known in Christendom today, but it is known to the Jews. Dispensationalism is a Jewish doctrine that's founded in the Bible. And according to Jewish dispensationalism, and you can look this up on the internet, the first 2100 years are called the Age of Desolation. You can Google on that term. The second 2100 years, they call it 2000, it's a shorthand, was called the Age of Torah. And you can also Google on that term. Messiah was supposed to come at the end of the second 2100 years. And of course he did come. After that, he was supposed to present himself to Israel. Israel was to believe in him. He was supposed to live the same length of time as David ruled, which was 40 years. Then he was supposed to die, and that moment is the 1000th anniversary of David's death. That was the outside limit of time. And 57 years after that would be the end of the second 2100 years from Adam's fall, the end of the Age of Torah. At that point, the millennium was supposed to begin. All right? This is what the Jews who were reading what Paul wrote, they were all brought up on. And the Christians, of course, learned that too, because Christianity in the beginning was, a breakaway sect of Judaism saying, hi, we got the right interpretation of the Bible. Okay, and so it was initially Jews versus Jews. Okay, and then, a lot of Gentiles got involved too, just like at the Exodus. So this whole thing here that I'm about to show you was scheduled, and the Mosaic Law interpreted it in two ways. They had a 50-year harvesting period for the Gentiles, followed by 7 years of the tribulation. That's why Messiah had to die 57 years before the end. There would be a 50-year period for the Gentiles. That's why Daniel 9 doesn't mention it. He's only accounting for the Jewish 490. He's not accounting for Gentile time. He doesn't have to. He already knows this from the Mosaic Law. The period of Jubilee depicted the last 50 years of history. Okay? And the Pentecost was harvesting the Gentiles. You can find that even on the internet today. The Jews understand that that's what it's for. That's also what Jubilee meant. And then the 7 years was actually the forecast of the tribulation goes all the way back probably to Noah. I haven't completely analyzed that yet, but that 7-year warning to Noah is somehow precedental for the tribulation, which is 7 years. All right? And that 7 years was encoded in the Mosaic Law via Passion Week, which was, Passover week. Okay, it was to end up being 7 years, and it was celebrated as 7 days, even as Pentecost was 50 days, representing 50 years, and then Jubilee tied to it as 50 years. Okay, so Moses had stuck that in the first 84 syllables of Psalm 90. Okay, and everybody knew about it. Isaiah updated it in Isaiah 53. And if you go through my Isaiah 53 videos, you'll see how he did that. And then Daniel updated it, which is why the tribulation is in Daniel 9:27. Okay? But Christ ended up dying 7 years earlier than he was supposed to. He ended up dying at age 33 instead of 40. So by the time church begins due to that, all right, there were a whole series of expected rapture dates because people for 2,000 years had been counting what year it was. They were supposed to do that. And so now how does the schedule alter? The church is here. And they were still expecting God to fit everything to the old timeline. And, Christ himself had said, Matthew 24 and Acts 1, he said, you can't predict it now. But people were still trying to do that. So Paul is going to cast his whole passage based on the expectations so people will get what he's really saying. All right, and we're going to walk through that. But first, look at the overview here. 66 AD was 7 years before the expected downfall of the temple. And I'm calling it 66 AD because that's how Paul's calling it. Or it happens to tie to our 66 AD, which I don't know how to explain that, but it was 7 years before the expected downfall of the temple, because the temple was supposed to last another 40 years. It was payback for the fact that Israel was 40 years late getting into the land. Okay, and Paul goes through that math a little bit in Acts 13, beginning about verse 20. Okay, but it was also payback to the Gentiles. See, it has to happen during Gentile time, this 40 years. All right? It was also payback to the Gentiles for Abraham maturing 54 years early. Okay? And I go through that explanation in the document so you can see it. So the idea was to pay back the Gentiles, because the Gentiles were already going to get a 50-year period. So this is like a subdivision within the 50 years. Hi, we're going to pay back the Gentiles because Abraham matured 54 years too early. He matured 2046 from Adam's fall rather than 2100. Okay, see, because 2100 years was allotted to the Gentiles, age of desolation. The Jews call it 2000, but it was really 2100. And Abraham was 54 years early, so how do the Gentiles get paid back that time? Well, one of the ways is, just as the land needed to be paid back the extra 40 years, that 40 years would be a subdivision of the 50. And then you got a 4-year piece left over, okay? And it's that 4-year piece that ends up turning this into 57. It's kind of I'm not explaining it as well as I'd like to, but you can read the explanation within the document, because I go through that and I have a lot of links that tie to it on page 5 and 6 of this document. So suffice it to say, just take it for the sake of argument right now, that 40 years after Christ actually died, they expected the temple to go down. Okay, well that would have been 73. But it could have gone down at the beginning of the tribulation rather than the end, especially given the way that Daniel is worded. In other words, it goes down, but they're still doing the sacrifices anyway, or some other scenario, some version of it would still play. So their first stop on the list was 66 AD, which happens to tie to when the Judaic rebellion began, as far as we say in our modern history. Okay, well, 7 years after that would be 73 AD, which would be exactly 40 years after he died, after he actually died, rather than the fact that he died, because he died 7 years early. Okay, but then what if that didn't happen? Because, like Christ said, you can't predict it. Okay, well, if it didn't happen, what about 77 AD? Because 50 years from when he really did die, we'll call that 33 AD, okay? 50 years from that is 83 AD, right here. another potential rapture date. All right. 7 years prior to that, though, the tribulation could have begun instead. Okay. And at the 50-year mark for harvesting the Gentiles, because everything's up for grabs now because of church. There could have been enough bodies in church to reflect Christ. God knows, that the material was out. Everybody understood it in those days. Whether they believed in it or not is another story. But the church could have matured in the 50 years, just as Daniel had, the original schedule under Daniel, had Israel accepted Christ. So it could have been the rapture at 66. It could have been the rapture at 73. It could have been the rapture at 77. It could have been the rapture at 83. And actually, that was the most likely time. Okay, you're going to see Paul address that too. It's really poignant how he does it. Because that's the 50-year mark that was originally scheduled, so the Gentiles would have gotten their full 50 years that was owed them, even though Christ died early. Okay, so that was the most likely point for the rapture that everybody was banking on. And then, of course, if he had died on time at age 40, 40 and 50, 50-year mark, would have been 90. And this is going to be really important for what you're going to see. Would have been 90. Okay, minus 7 would have been 84. So you see we got two different ways this 84 number could have been met as his age, what his age would have been under each of these scenarios. Now it's particularly evocative, this 84, because Moses in Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4, verse 4 is on the 1,000 years, the millennium. Okay? And it's very interesting that that's the number of syllables he uses, especially because this ends up being the most likely time for the rapture had Christ died on time, because at that point the 50 years would have elapsed and 7 would be left, culminating at the 90 mark. All right? And Moses had used 84 to close off Psalm 90 verse 4. And he does it on purpose. That's a sum of 70, which is a voting period, which I'll get into a little more later, and 14, which was the number of years Israel was going to be short due to rebuilding the temple. It would take 14 years longer, total of 21, longer than it should have. So Moses stored up the extra 14 inside Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4, and I go through that in my Psalm 90 videos, Meter of Time. So this is the most pregnant period right in here for the rapture to happen. But it could have happened sooner. So that's why we saw these earlier dates. Now, if the rapture had happened then, okay, that would have been 84 AD, which we're going to see Paul actually use that. And then if he had died on time 50 years from when he was supposed to die, that would have been 90 AD. See, this is 50 minus 7. So what if the temple doesn't go down until the 50-year mark? All right? Which means that history should have ended in what we would have called 98 AD, or what Paul would be calling 98 AD. Because this would have been the rapture. It's always happening to kick off the tribulation. But you see, you got this series of dates that occurs because he didn't die on time and because church is unpredictable. And Paul is banking on them knowing these dates because he's going to use each one of these dates for his meter. And now we're going to see how. Okay? So now we come back here. All right, hopefully you got some sense of how there's a series of rollout rapture dates that Paul's going to play on in order to communicate what he wants to say. So, here's the sotto voce. If the rapture had occurred in what Paul is calling 66 AD, then we would have been up in heaven saying, "We are in you from the founding of the world." That ties exactly to Psalm 90 verse 1. You are our refuge from generation to generation. It's a play on what was written. And notice that it's 66 syllables instead of 24. 24 is the number of syllables that Moses used. Okay, so he's adding 44 more syllables for church. Okay, That's really very evocative when you stop to do the math. So I'm going to let you do that on your own. But we would be saying, if we were actually up there, the tribulation occurred here, this would be our testimony. And it's the exact same style that Moses follows. Each verse in Psalm 90 looks really syrupy and generic on the surface, just like this text does here. Okay? But they're testimonies. They're testimonies to that period. And the one speaking the testimony varies depending on who you're talking about. Okay? Like here it's Christ, and then it becomes us. Christ is saying, worthy of glory is God the Father. That's why he's growing up. Okay? And when we're raptured, we're going to be saying this. In fact, a lot of Christians use this as a doxology, starting in the 1st century, for this very reason. They understood what I'm telling you now. Okay? So, if we're raptured at 66, we're going to be saying, in him, before the founding of the world. We'll be standing there as that sea of glass, like it's depicted in Revelation 4, praising him. All right? Okay, well, what if it doesn't happen at 66? Because that was 10 years future to Paul, and I don't know if he knew he was going to die here, but that's what happened. R68 AD at that point. Okay, well, if it doesn't happen then, what if it happens at 73? Oh, well then that's eine gemas hagios. We are holy. That would be our testimony at that point, if it happened in 73. Okay, and the temple goes down then, because again, that's 40 years after Christ actually died. So that was their next expected rapture date. And this would be our testimony. That much of it. Okay, well, what if it happens in 77? Oh, well, then we got the rest of the statement. Kai amomos. Blemish-free. This is a special word in Greek for a blemish-free animal used for sacrifice. Okay? At that point, the temple would have been built over the same number of years, okay, from 56. The temple would have been built. Christ would have been 77 years old, and that's extremely evocative in the meter because that's the age that David was when he died. The scholars misaccount that because they're using Josephus rather than the Bible. And Isaiah used 77 as the age of David's death to start Isaiah 52, 13 through 15. Luke 3 plays off that when he says Christ is the 77th son. So, of course, Paul is going to pick that as his age. The 77th son is 77. You get the width there. Okay, and then we'd be saying this whole sentence. And that would be our testimony before Christ, standing in the throne room. We are holy, blemish-free. See how cute that is? Okay. Well, what if it doesn't happen at 77? Okay, well, the really likely rapture date is at 84, as I just showed you. Okay, and then this would be our testimony before him, by his standard. And Paul is really saying, you know what, this is going to be a crisis time right here. That's why he breaks it into a separate 7. So he's saying that, you know what, between 77 and 84 AD is a crisis time. Well, we know that it was a crisis time. First of all, Nero had just come to power right here when Paul writes. He'd been in power for, depending if you want to call this 58 AD, Nero had been in power for about 4 years. Okay, 4 or 5 years. And he was a young kid at the time. He was still a teenager. Okay? And then by 66, of course, that's at that point, Rome had burned, and that was when the Christians were being blamed. So if the Christians were martyred or the rapture had begun then, Nero would have been the Antichrist. And we would all be saying before him, before the founding of the world. And to be honest, you can start to understand why preterism builds itself the way it does, because they thought that Nero was the Antichrist. Okay, and you can see where they're getting at. Even from the meter, if they knew it, which they didn't, but, you can start to see, okay, I mean, I'm saying preterism is toast and it's bad and everything, but at the same time, I can see where they get it. And I'm trying to sort of semi-defend them. Okay, every doctrine that everybody espouses has a basis somewhere. It's just that they're, all of us got to do more homework than we've done. Okay, so Nero would have been the Antichrist in that year. All right, and of course he executes Paul probably at the very beginning of 68 AD, and he himself dies in June of 68 AD, according to most historians. That's the year that they bring it. And that was the year of the four emperors, and that was the year that Peter wrote shortly before he ended up dying, because Peter was in Babylon. Babylon was a property at that time of Parthia, and Parthia had just been in this, pretty much this year, the same year that Rome burned, really, 64, according to our records. Parthia had just been brought to heel by Nero. He had won a major victory against Parthia. So they were rounding up Christians in Babylon, and that's how come, Peter ended up dying. He died in Babylon. He was never in Rome. So again, what if it was 73? We talked about that. What if it was 77? We talked about that. And then here was the most pregnant point of it, because it would have fulfilled the 50 years to the Gentiles at this point. So that's why Paul is breaking it up. Paul is saying, you know what? Christianity is going to be at an all-time low. It's going to be at an all-time low because of the persecutions that begin circa 66 AD. And of course, that's when the Judaic revolt also began. So he's benchmarking both events. Okay, the persecution of the Christians and the Jews at this time. And then, so that's a likely rapture date. And then by 77 especially, because of the significance of it, because temple building would have been done. Okay, if church had passed and matured, this would have been a likely event. And if church had not yet matured, then this would have happened anyway, because to get her to mature. In other words, this 7 is occurring. The rapture always occurs because of apostasy among Christians. It is not occurring for a good reason. It's occurring for a bad reason. It's occurring because we're apostate. And the apostasy in Christianity was marked, especially after the persecutions began under Nero. There was widespread disaffection. And after the temple did go down here, okay, which is highlighted now in black, there were a lot of disaffections away. Okay, the book of Hebrews came out, the book of Jude came out, Peter came out, and the Gospel of Mark came out, all this time to warn of the upcoming destruction of the temple. And when it did get destroyed, a lot of people fell away from Christianity and Judaism all at the same time. So this was a black time, okay, for Christianity. So it was a very big likely time for the tribulation to occur. Also because it was the end of the 50 years for the Gentiles. So Paul benchmarks it here. What if the rapture occurred when Christ would have been 84? Well, if it had, we'd be saying before him by his standard, katanopion autou. All right, and that's a very katanopion is a good phrase. The kat there means according to his standards, kata. All right. So that's a likely rapture date. Okay. And if it doesn't happen, then that means the church, and this is really important to say, then church flunked. If we didn't grow up by the 21 years after Paul is writing, and we still don't grow up by the 7, which is a very dark time for Christianity at that point, because there's a lot of mass defection due to the temple going down and a lot of other reasons, persecution, then for church to go on even longer means the church has got, mostly negative votes. But even when times are bad, there are always a few who mature. And the whole criterion, which Paul's going to lay out in Ephesians 4:13, the whole criterion for the rapture is to attain the maturity of Christ. Now, that verse is pretty well translated in King James and many others, not all of them, but especially in the King James, that verse is well translated. The stature of the fullness of the maturity of Christ. All right? That's the criterion for the rapture. And it only takes a few to be that high, because everybody else is going to be ruled by those kings. So then the rest of the church believers would be, inherited by those kings. That's Isaiah 53:12, the mighty ones. Okay, it refers to both Jews and Gentiles, but right now Paul is just looking at the church, the church portion. Okay, so it could have happened. All right, but what if it didn't? Okay, well then we get to hear, this is so clever, I just want to die. In agape. Okay? In agape prorisas. Now, if you say that prorisas real fast, you slur the two O's together. Prorisas, if you slur it. So you got in agape prorisas. Okay, how many syllables is that? En agape prorisa. 7 syllables. You got that? What's 84 plus 7? 91. All right? And that is exactly what I just shown you back when we were looking at the verse note, the first 4 note, would have been 50 years after Christ's own on-time death had he died on time at age 40. 50 years from that would be 90, and this is 7 syllables to begin the 91st year. We're beginning the 91st year, and this would be our testimony. Okay, actually it would just be, by means of love he foreordained. We wouldn't be saying us, because we're the ones saying it. By means of love he foreordained. You got that? Isn't that cute? Okay, well, what if we didn't make it to 91? And that's real important, because you see Paul is making a paragraph of 91 here, which I'm going to explain in a minute.